Hey gang, Pastor Josh here. We're doing video 8 of the walk through the Bible. As you can see, I got kicked to the garage. It's too noisy in there. Murray's working, and so here we are. But I like it. This is Noah and I's man cave. So welcome. Glad you're here. Let's say a prayer. Dear Lord, thank you for these stories, your word, the narrative that you give to us to learn what you want us to learn. You speak through these stories, through these people that lived in faith so long ago, Lord, and may this inspire us to live by faith in our times. We pray this in Jesus' name, and everybody said, Amen. Wake up the flowers. So let's do our drawing. This is the Fertile Crescent. So we have the Mediterranean Sea, the eastern side of that. Down here, the Nile River. And this is Egypt. Here in Israel, we have the Sea of Galilee, River Jordan, down into the Dead Sea. Two major rivers of the Fertile Crescent, the Euphrates and the Tigris, going down into the Persian Gulf. Then we have the Red Sea, the Sinai Peninsula, on which is Mount Sinai, where Moses received the law. And then right outside the Promised Land, we do a circle around the Promised Land, is Mount Nebo. And that's where, if you remember, Moses gave the law again. He repeated it. Deuteronomy is the repeat of the law to that second generation. Then they entered into the Promised Land with Joshua as the leader. And then after Joshua, there was the age of the judges. They were the rulers of Israel, judges, and they were just people that God chose to rise up and lead. And God gave them the spirit to lead. And so they could come from any tribe, they could come from any family, it didn't matter. They became a leader. And now the last judge and the first prophet is who? Samuel. Samuel was the last judge, and he became the first prophet. In essence, there was prophets before this, but a prophet to the king, a prophet that would have advised the king, because what happened during Samuel's lifetime as judge, the people asked for a king and God granted them a king. Who was the first king of Israel? Nope, it was Saul. Because you probably said David, didn't you? And that's what most people do. Saul was the first king. Then David was anointed, because Saul didn't have a heart for God. David did have a heart for God. And Samuel was the prophet during David's age, even though he had been the judge, the leader himself. He then gave over leadership to Saul, and he was the prophet during Saul's age. And when David was anointed king, Samuel was the prophet. You remember, he anointed David as a child. And then he did die before David became the king over Saul. And then David had the prophet Nathan advising him. And Saul had Samuel. And Samuel told Saul that you are not following God's instructions. And so he is going to... Samuel was walking away, and Saul grabbed his cloak and it ripped away. And Samuel said, God is going to tear away the kingdom from you, Saul. So he used that as symbolic. So we have the life of David. And if I'm meeting you in person and we're doing this in the classroom, then we would really spend a lot of time, because the life of David we see is the life of David is all through, his whole life is in the Bible. There's a lot of characters in the Bible that we just get some of their life, or like Moses went over here to Midian for 40 years. We don't hear anything about that. With David, we get him as a young boy, And then we get everything that happens through his life is told. And David writes Psalms during his life. And we have those Psalms, those poems, those songs that even some of them refer to this is written by David when he was going through this, and then he expresses it. So we really get a lot of David's life, and that is in 1st and 2nd Samuel. In fact, let's just go back and through the books of the Bible and get to the point where we are right now. What's the first book of the Bible? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Then, so that's Moses's books. Then the next leader after Moses is Joshua. Then there is the era of Judges. So the next book is Judges. Then there's a sweet love story, Ruth. And then begins the 2 books about David. They are called 1st and 2nd Samuel, written by Samuel, although during 2nd Samuel, Samuel dies, so someone else must have picked up the pen and finished the story. So 1st Samuel talks about David's rise to power. At the end of 1 Samuel, Saul dies in battle and David becomes king. And then 2 Samuel talks about David's pilgrimage as king. David was not a perfect person. He made lots of mistakes. The thing about him, when he made a mistake, he admitted it. He confessed to God and he repented, which means not only confessing and feeling bad, but change. He examined himself and said, I see, God, where I was wrong. And he sought to change and grow. And that's what God always wants from us. A relationship with God demands change. We are always growing. He's growing us to a certain goal. Do you know what the goal is that Jesus wants us to grow? It is Jesus. We are trying to be like Jesus. We are growing closer to Jesus. That is our goal as Christians. So it's never time to say, I know everything. You can know all these answers, but God is always going to grow you. You can't say, I'm done growing. That doesn't work in a relationship, in any relationship, to be honest. We're always in a relationship with somebody. We're always learning from them and we're growing with them. And that's what life is all about. And that's what you guys are doing. You're growing. And so I'm growing with you as I do this. Even though I've done this for years, I do it with groups and we grow together. In a relationship with God and with Jesus, of course, is going to bring about growth in us. Just knowing them brings about growth. So that's what David, the book 2 Samuel is about David's pilgrimage. And that's a word for walking a long distance. And it's kind of a picture of our life. We go on a long pilgrimage. And so David he rises to power and popularity, and then one of his sons tries to usurp him, which means take the throne from him, and he has to run away from Jerusalem. And that was actually, God said, there is a punishment, there's consequence for some of your sin. And so one of your sons is going to try to take over your kingdom, and you're going to have to escape through Jerusalem. And he did. He had to leave Jerusalem. And then over time, God allowed him to get back on the throne and be the leader again. So 2 Samuel is about pilgrimage. The great thing about this is I'm not telling you anything that you can't read yourself. And so you can find David's story in 1st and 2nd Samuel. David was a man after God's heart. He had a heart for God. That is what you want to remember for David. David had many wives. They could do that back then, especially a king. And it doesn't sound like a good idea to me. And in fact, it really wasn't. But he had many sons. And then he had to choose one of his sons to be the next king, because now, unlike judges could pop up from anywhere. Now, any tribe, any family, any occupation, all of a sudden this person they could tell that God is upon them and they're the leader. Now it's going to go through the family line of David. In fact, David is promised by God that one of his descendants, that means one of his sons or grandsons or great-grandsons, all the way down the line, one of them would actually, God said this through the prophet Nathan, would rule on the throne of God's kingdom forever. That was promised to David. It's called the Davidic covenant. Do you know who David's descendant was that reigns on the throne forever? You do know. It's Jesus. Jesus came from the line of David. That's why, remember, he was born in Bethlehem, the city of David, and his parents were there because both of them came from the line of David. And so they were in the city of David. They had to go for a census. They had to go to their hometown, the land that belonged to their family, and that was Bethlehem. So Jesus was that person who came through David, and that gave us, as we go through the Old Testament, that gives us a really good picture of who Jesus is. He's the king, monarch, one ruler, and he's the king that was promised to David. And David was in a palace. He established Jerusalem as the capital, and he built it up, and he had this beautiful palace. And he looked down from the palace and he saw the tent tabernacle. Remember that the tent tabernacle was built when Moses was in Mount Sinai for that year, and then the Levites would take care of it. Now, when they came into the promised land, they established it in a little town called Shiloh. And we have a girl at Monarch named Shiloh, and she really likes that story. And so this place called Shiloh, and for the years of the judges, that is where the tent tabernacle stayed, and the Levites lived there. It was a village of Levites, and people would go for Passover and the other festivals. They would go to Shiloh. But when David established Jerusalem down here remember last time, on the border of Benjamin and Judah down here, he had the Levites, and he had them bring the tent tabernacle and set it up in Jerusalem. But then when he was in a palace, he thought, boy, it's just a tent. Why don't we build a palace? Why don't we build a temple for God? And God said to David, you're not going to build it, but one of your sons is. And so David's son that became the next king, so this would be the third king of Israel, right? Because we had Saul, David, and now David's son. And his son that was anointed king was Solomon. And Solomon was very special because when he was young and he realized, I'm going to be the anointed king, God came to him in a dream and said, Solomon, make a wish. What can I give you? Now, if you found a genie, or God came to you in a dream and said, I'll give you anything you want. What is it that you want? You get one wish. What would you wish for? I know what you're thinking, because I'm thinking the same thing. We're thinking long life. We're thinking wealth, as much money as a jillion, trillion, zillion dollars. And then we're thinking, okay, we might be thinking that we want God to manipulate some other people for us, so make these other people do something that we want them to do. But Solomon didn't ask for any of those things. In fact, what Solomon said was, God, since I am chosen to be the next king and I'm only young, give me a wise and discerning heart so that I can lead your people. And God was so impressed by his request that he didn't ask for the other things. He said, Solomon, I will not only give you that wisdom, I will give you everything else. And so Solomon lived a long time. He was very wealthy, and he had peace all around him. None of his enemies, and that's what we would wish for, God protecting us from other people and that kind of stuff. And that's what God did. He protected Solomon. And so during that time, this was what's called the zenith of Israel, the height. Okay, that means they had the most land at that time. Remember the Fertile Crescent, all these people want to take over the land. They had the most land. They were the wealthiest at that time, and they had the most respect from all the other nations. In fact, people heard how wise Solomon was in this queen of Sheba. Sheba's way, way down. We're not sure exactly, but we think it's way, way, way down here, the bottom of the Arabian Peninsula, way down here. And she traveled all the way up to visit Solomon, to ask him really hard questions. And she was so impressed with his wisdom. She said, all that was said about you is true, and you're even more than what was said. You're even more wise. And so she was just really impressed. So this time, I want you to remember this date. This date, when Solomon was king, and it was the zenith, that means the top, the high point, like the zenith of a mountain. That is the high point, was in 1000 BC. 1000 BC, okay? That's when Solomon was the king, the zenith of Israel. How long, how much time, how much history have we gone through then? Do you remember when we started? Back in Ur? Where in the Bible? Genesis 12. Where in the world? Ur. When? 2000 BC. So you and I have walked through 1,000 years. We're now at 1000 BC with Solomon as king. And that's what you want to remember. David anoints one of his sons king, Solomon. And at what time was the zenith of Israel? 1000 BC, during Solomon's reign. And that was because God blessed him so much. Now, Solomon did live a long time, but not forever. That's going to be that king that was promised to David, that ends up being Jesus, who lives forever. But Solomon did not. And so now he has to choose one of his sons king. And so he chooses his son called Rehoboam. And this is the way you spell that. And I'm going to do a little bit of a chart over here so you can see this. Rehoboam is now the next king. Rehoboam. Rehoboam. Now, unfortunately, Rehoboam did not ask for wisdom from God. We don't have a story of God coming to him, asking him what he wants, but he did not seek God for wisdom. We can all seek God for wisdom. The book of Proverbs talks about it. Wisdom calls out in the street, calls out to us. God's calling out to us saying, seek me and you will find wisdom. So it's available to all of us. Rehoboam did not seek wisdom. And so what happened was something very sad, and it's called a schism. That is a big word, a schism. SCHISM, I think. Double check me. But what happened was, now this is Israel, and it's split into two nations. There was a civil war, essentially. Judah and Israel. Those are the names. It was Israel at this point, but the northern became Israel, Israel, and the southern was the main tribe there. It was just Benjamin and Judah in the southern, and that they named Judah. All right? And what happened was, one of Solomon's generals was this great strong man, and he was from up here in Israel, and his name, by chance, was Jeroboam. This is interesting. So we have Rehoboam, and now we have, make sure you can see this, Jeroboam. And what Jeroboam did, that's an O. What Jeroboam did was he went to Rehoboam when Rehoboam was anointed king, and he said, we will serve you. This is the northern 10 tribes, and like I said, these are the 2 tribes of Judah and Benjamin. We will serve you. He came representing the northern 10 tribes and said, we will serve you as our king. We'll accept you as our king if you will be kind to us. And Rehoboam said, let me think about that on how I'm going to treat you. Because he had all the power. He could kind of make them his slaves, or he could tax them heavily. He can make them do work for him. And what they said is, be kind to us. Let us, like we do here in America, let us be free to do whatever we want, and we'll contribute, but we want to be free. And so what happened was, Jeroboam went to Rehoboam, and Rehoboam said, let me think about it. Instead of talking to his father's advisors, Solomon had some advisors, and they were wise because they knew Solomon and were around Solomon, so they picked up all that wisdom. We talked about growing in a relationship. They were the people that Solomon grew with in his wisdom. And they said, oh yes, you should answer with kindness to the northern tribes. They're our brothers and sisters. But then Rehoboam went to his friends, who he said, well, I've got my own advisors. And they said, no, it's time for you to take control and show who's boss. And so Rehoboam went with the younger, and he said to Jeroboam, he said, I am going to rule over you even worse than any other king did. And so what happened was Jeroboam said, okay, we're out. We're going to create our own country. And that's just what they did. The 10 tribes up here became Israel, and the 2 tribes of Judah. So now in this era of kings, we're going to have 2 kings at the same time, because you're going to have a king of Israel and a king of Judah. And the books that show this are Kings and Chronicles. There's 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and they both go through this same stage of kings. And so what happens is we have Rehoboam and Jeroboam. Rehoboam is king of Judah. Remember, he was he was Solomon's son. So we had Saul, David, Solomon, and now Rehoboam is the 4th king. But Jeroboam became, even though he's just a general, he became the king of Israel. And so he's the 1st king of Israel. So we're following these 2 different kings because we have 2 different countries. I know it's a little bit confusing, but you can stick with me. And so through the history, we have this is something you want to remember, along with Rehoboam and Jeroboam, each one of them had about 20 kings. All right, you want to remember, how many kings did each country have after the schism, after the split? Well, they each had about 20 kings. Now, Israel had 20 kings, but the kings didn't live as long, and there was a lot of usurping. There was a lot of kings taking over for other kings, and rising up and becoming the king. And so 20 for them didn't take as long as 20 for Israel, because Israel didn't take as long as Judah. Judah, everyone was supposed to come from the family of David. They were supposed to be descendants of David. Israel didn't really have that. And so this person would claim king, and then all of a sudden this person would claim king, and there would be violence. And Israel is a very sad story. Judah you'd have some good kings and some bad kings. Israel was mostly bad kings. They had a few that were pretty good, but for the most part, they were all bad because they were always after power. Judah the good kings saw that David was blessed by God. He was chosen by God, and they needed to serve, not try to gain power. They were there, like Solomon in his wisdom, to serve the people. Do you see? There's two ways to look at it. I'm either the boss and I'm trying to have power over everybody, and that's what's on my mind, or God chose me to be a leader, and therefore I need to be a servant leader. I need to care about everyone else. I need to serve. So let me go through these questions real quick. I've got them written down. Who is Solomon's anointed son? And that's Rehoboam. He's the next king after Solomon. Civil war in Israel breaks out. So the year that this breaks out is 933 BC. That's when this split between Rehoboam and Jeroboam happened. What is the capital? This is good. What is the capital of each? Well, down here, we still have Jerusalem. And then the capital up here is called Samaria. So we have Jerusalem here in Judah. And there was a mountain and a village city there next to the mountain. It was called Samaria, spelled Samaria. I know these are hard, but these are big money questions when you come to your Jeopardy. And then approximately, how many kings were in each kingdom? And that is 20. So you can watch this last part and look at this to memorize. You can watch it again. See that you can memorize what happened here. And so I will tell you how these kingdoms, because you're saying, okay, there's only 20 kings, so there must be an end. Well, there was an end. And I will tell you what happened to end each kingdom. And I will do that next week. See you then.